Hello, everybody. As some of you may know, and some of you don't, Canada suddenly has a new prime minister. His name is Mark J. Carney, and he's the replacement for Justin Trudeau, running the Liberal Party in Canada. That means that we Canadians need to know who Mark Carney is, and to the degree that Canada has a role to play internationally, that everybody needs to know. So, if you want to know who Canada's new prime minister is, and you want to know who Mark J. Carney is, and whether or not you should support him or vote for him if you're Canadian, or what you should think of him if you're part of the international audience, then this is the podcast for you. Carney is a mystery to Canadians in large part, not least because he's been a political figure for a very short period of time. And the election that's being called is a snap election, so Canadians aren't going to have, and the rest of the world aren't going to have a lot of time to get to know him before the determination of his status as Prime Minister is going to be finalized. Now, I want to make a case for Carney first, as powerfully as I can, so that we give the devil his due, so to speak. And I think the right way to do that is with a review of his resume. It's quite clear to me that Canadians are entranced with Carney, whose Liberal Party has risen dramatically in the polls in the last month. They're entranced with him for two reasons. And one is because Trump has been careening around like a bull in the china shop with regards to his comments about Canada, placing tariffs on Canada and describing us as not worthy of having our own country and fated, if we're lucky, to become the 51st state. This has produced a groundswell of pro-Canadian sentiment. In consequence, even among Liberals who haven't been noted for their patriotism over the last 10 years, this is a common occurrence in Canada. Historically, it's very frequently the case that in Canada, we learn to pull together because of a threat, real or supposed, emanating from the American elephant that occupies the place of primacy south of us. So Carney has got, and the Liberals have got a boost because of Trump's rampaging around, but also because Carney is a new face and a new fresh face, and so hypothetically, and so people who are a little leery, let's say, of the Conservatives under Poilievre have every reason to hope that Carney is the right man for the time. Now, he's capitalized on that to some degree by positioning himself as an outsider who will bring fresh new ideas and a novel and innovative approach to the Canadian political situation, and we'll take that claim apart a little bit later. Suffice it to say that the combination of his novelty and the knockoff consequences of Trump's comments with regard to Canada have moved the Liberals over the last month from a place where they were essentially facing electoral extinction of a historically unprecedented sort to neck and neck, or arguably in the lead of Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives. And so why have Canadians turned to Carney apart from Trump? Well, Carney has a remarkable resume. And if the choice is Carney or Pierre Poilievre, it would be easy for Canadians to assume that Carney has everything that Poilievre does and more. Poilievre's a career politician, and that means he's faced the electorate. It means he's done a lot of door-to-door knocking. It means he's listened to Canadians at the ground level and been appraised of their concerns, and Carney doesn't have that. But Poilievre is also a career politician. Now, Carney is a career bureaucrat, and he has a resume that on the face of it, you might be regarded as preferable in its depth to Poilievre's. So I want to familiarize you with his resume, and then I want to walk you through what it signifies, because we should assess not only what he's done and what he looks like on paper, but what that actually means practically and conceptually speaking, and with regards to its impact on Canada and the broader world. So we're going to start by walking through his resume. So currently, as we already pointed out, he's Prime Minister of Canada, and that's been the case since March 14th. Now, here's a couple of things to understand about that. The first is that he's Prime Minister and he holds no seat in the House of Commons, which means he hasn't faced any electorate. He does not have a mandate from the Canadian people. And about 130,000 Liberals voted for him. So he's basically become Prime Minister with no test of the validity of his personality or his political stance being presented to Canada by a tiny proportion of the Canadian population. It's about half of 1% of the Canadian electorate. And so that means it's actually incumbent on him to do exactly what he's doing, which is to call an election, but also not to be parading around the world, let's say, especially in places like Europe, acting as if he is Prime Minister with a mandate. Now, he's done a fair bit of that in the last couple of weeks, and we want to keep that in mind. And we also want to keep in mind the fact that the election is very likely to be of incredibly short duration, because there's a reason for that too. Okay, so currently as Prime Minister, that's obviously somewhat impressive. He got a bachelor's degree from Harvard in 1988 and developed an interest in economics at that point. Then he went to the University of Oxford. So these are major league educational institutions. And back in the late 80s and the early 90s, they were still highly credible institutions, I would say. So he was at Harvard in 1988. I was teaching there from 92 to 96. My experience at Harvard was stellar. I thought it was an absolutely remarkable institution. So again, I said I would give the devil his due. And to become a bachelor, to get a bachelor's from Harvard is a genuine accomplishment. It certainly indicates that you have a fair bit of raw cognitive power and some real conscientious discipline. And then he went to Oxford, which is another one of the world's premier universities. He got a master's degree in economics in 93 and a doctorate in 95. And then he has an honorary degree from the University of Manitoba, doctorate of laws. So educationally, that's very stellar. Now, with regards to his professional experience, he was governor of the Bank of Canada, and that's a major deal as well. And then, even more impressively, he was governor of the Bank of England from July 1st, 2013 to March 15th, 2020. Now, that's pretty impressive, because it's not typical for the Brits to hire someone who isn't one of their own, so to speak, although he does hold British and Irish passports, to lead an institution as august as the Bank of England. And so again, on first glance, it would be reasonable for Canadians to surmise that Mr. Carney has had his credentials vetted not only within Canada and with regards to these educational institutions, but by the relatively skeptical Brits who decided he was the man to run an operation as significant as the Bank of England. Goldman Sachs, he worked for Goldman Sachs, a huge financial organization from 1990 to 2003, where he was managing director of investment banking. He worked in London, Tokyo, New York, and Toronto offices. He worked in the Department of Finance in Canada from 2004 to 2008. He was chair and head of transition investing. Now that's getting a little more relevant to the point we're going to make later. He was chair and head of transition investing for Brookfield Asset Management from 2020 to 25. He just resigned upon entering the political sphere. He oversaw investments in renewable energy. And then he was United Nations Special Envoy for Climate Action and Finance from 2020 to 2025 as well. He was appointed by Antonio Guterres, who's the Secretary General of the UN, to mobilize private finance for climate goals. He co-founded the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. Okay, so now we need to take that apart. Now, he's also written a book, Values, Building a Better World for All, which was published in 2021, and we're going to talk about that as well. So what do we say about Carney's experience and his resume? Well, the real question is, what is he aiming at? Right, so he's got a stellar educational background and this vast experience on the international side. But the question is, what has he concluded from that? And what has he done in consequence? And what is he planning to do in the future? Now, I read Carney's book, Values, very, very carefully. And so the reason I want to walk you through that is because that's his carefully thought through statement of principles and aims. And so it's useful to take a person at his word on the written side. And so I think we can derive from values what Carney's values are, what values he thinks Canadians do and should hold, what we can conclude about what he's already done for Canada and on the international stage and where things are headed in the future. And so now I'm going to take Carney's values book apart in two ways. The first thing I want to tell you is what he thinks Canadians' values are. Okay, so he's setting himself up as an arbiter of the Canadian ethos. And to do that in his book, in the first couple of chapters, and then at the end of the book, he tells us all what makes Canada the country that it is. And so we want to delve into that. All right, so Carney's conclusion with regards to Canada's core values are a leftist, utopian, globalist view of the Western tradition. So he believes, for example, that the core Canadian values are fairness and equity, resilience and adaptability, sustainability and responsibility, and community and cooperation. Okay, so the first thing I'd like to do, those are all terms that sound positive and that could, in principle, bring people together on the basis of a vision. Fairness and equity, resilience and adaptability, sustainability and responsibility, community and cooperation. But the first thing I'd like to point out to all of you who are listening is that although Carney claims that those are core Canadian values, that claim is not correct. Those are core globalist, socialist, utopian, net zero promoting environmentalist values. But the core Canadian values are actually derived from the Judeo-Christian, Western, broadly Western, and English common law tradition. And so I'm going to outline what those are, just so you can see the contrast between those values, which are the true Canadian values, and Carney's values, which have this patina or aura of high-flown positive emotion, but bear little relationship to the genuine historical reality and do not describe the values that made Canada the wealthy, free, productive Western democracy that it is. So Canada is actually founded on the principles of individual liberty and rights, the rule of law, equality and justice. And equality there doesn't mean equality of outcome, and it doesn't mean economic equality. It means equality of value before the law and equality of opportunity and responsibility and order. And so those are values that are very different than the value set that Carney is putting forward. And so then you might ask, if Carney didn't derive what he believes Canadian values to be from the historical reality of Canada, from what source did he derive his values? Now, you also might wonder why it's important to even delve into this. And well, the first conclusion we could draw is that Carney wouldn't have written a whole book about values if he didn't think that it was important to delve into values. And he certainly wouldn't have written a book revealing his own values if he didn't think it was important to communicate to Canadians and people around the world what he thinks Canadian values and his values are and should be. So my focus on values, although I certainly believe, as he does, that values are fundamentally important, I'm focusing on values because that's the focus that Carney himself chose. All right, so this is where we can link the facts of his resume to an analysis of his genuine motivations.
Success in business isn't just about offering an amazing product or service, though that's certainly essential. What truly sets thriving companies apart is having powerful, reliable tools working behind the scenes to streamline every aspect of the selling process. These are the systems that turn the complex challenge of reaching customers and processing sales into something that feels effortless and natural. That's exactly where Shopify enters the picture, transforming the way businesses operate in the digital age. Nobody does selling better than Shopify. They're home to the #1 checkout on the planet. And here's the game changer. With Shop Pay, they're boosting conversions up to 50%. That means fewer abandoned carts and more sales going to your bottom line. In today's world, your business needs to be everywhere your customers are, whether that's scrolling through social media, shopping online, or walking into a physical store. Shopify powers it all, seamlessly connecting your business across the web, your store, customer feeds, and everywhere in between. And here's the truth. Businesses that sell more sell on Shopify. Join over 2 million entrepreneurs who have already discovered the power of unified commerce with Shopify's all-in-one platform. Upgrade your business to the same checkout we use with Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/JBP, all lowercase. Head to shopify.com/JBP to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/JBP.
So let's first look in more detail at how Carney translates his core values into the beginnings of policy. All right, so Carney, in his book Values, outlines his support for three of what I regard as the least credible ideas that have emerged on the international landscape and the intellectual landscape in the last 20 years. So first of all, he's an explicit advocate of the diversity, equity, and inclusivity principles that have destroyed the modern universities, that have corrupted our judiciary and our political institutions, and that have allowed the liberals to smuggle, the modern federal liberals, to smuggle in what's essentially a relatively radical leftist agenda under the guise of classical liberalism. Diversity, inclusivity, and equity, the DEI holy trinity, is a political policy movement predicated on the idea that Western society, and that would include Canada, is a corrupt patriarchy in its essence that marginalizes a variety of groups, and purposefully so, delegitimizing them, and that the appropriate response to that is to segregate and identify people on the basis of their group identity, and that would include race and sex and gender and all the other isms, all the other ism identities that you may have heard in the last 10 years, to divide people on the basis of those identities and to privilege the marginalized, to bring them to the center. Now, some of that presumption derives from postmodern philosophy, and some of it is essentially Marxist in its orientation. And so Carney's derivation of Canadian values, when the pedal hits the metal, let's say, or the rubber hits the road, the manner in which Carney translates his interpretation of Canadian values is the same manner that the radical leftists in the Democratic Party, for example, in the United States, translated the same value propositions. And that's to become an advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusivity, and to assume that human beings should be divided on the basis of their race and their sexual identity and their gender, etc., and that our culture is essentially oppressive at its core. And so I believe that idea to be discreditable across multiple dimensions of analysis, and it's certainly the case that it was roundly rejected by the American electorate in the last election cycle. And you can also see that the Democrats themselves in the United States are backpedaling rapidly on the DEI front because they realize that it's a losing game in the short, medium, and long run. And so the first thing we might note is that when Carney is trying to formulate policy, one of the sets of policies that he put forward include this discreditable and divisive DEI formulation that's been part and parcel of the maneuvers by intellectuals to tilt the entire political world in a radically revolutionary and leftist direction. Okay, now, Carney also points out that he's a free market advocate, but you see, this is a rather serpentine proposition because in his book Values, Carney also points out that all things considered, although the free market is necessary, it doesn't really do a good job of valuing the world. So he points out, for example, that it's preposterous that Amazon, the company, is valued financially, economically, higher than the Amazon rainforest. And while that sounds good in principle, it's a very vague and foolish claim. What Carney is pointing out is that the free market system